everybody. Aaron Grizzell here from the Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation and from the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival here in San Francisco, California. We're happy to participate in Comic-Con's at-home panels this year with a discussion on Afro-Futurism and Black Religion, featuring John Jennings, the two-time Eisner Award winner, and two eminent scholars of Afrofuturism, Kinitra Brooks from Michigan State University and Sakena Young-Scaggs from Arizona State University. Now, because we really got into this thing, we had to sort of clip and cut. And so we want to pick up the conversation with John Jennings discussing his latest forthcoming work, The Parable of the Sower, the graphic novel adaptation of Octavia Butler's famous work.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
So look, we've been dancing for the last half hour or so. And so we don't want to disturb. We had to do the little intro piece, to let everybody know, what's going on. But let's dig back into where we were. We're focusing in on the phenomenological aspects of and the connectivity, the sort of the natural sort of flow between Afrofuturism and Black religion, sort of writ large, and how that connects not only with the imagination, but with the real lived out experience that we can then create expressive modes for in the Afrofuturist space. I know, John, you are currently sort of following up your sort of #1 bestseller, Kindred, the graphic novel, with the graphic novel adaptation of Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. Sort of give us an idea of sort of that experience and what that experience, one, has taught you and how you sort of flow into that in the Afrofuturist space and how that sort of informed your work going forward here.
Okay. Well, first of all, because of the success of the first graphic novel, Damian Duffy, who's my co-adapter, who actually has the daunting task of taking Octavia Butler's work and filtering it into a graphic novel script. He's so good at it too. And he would say he isn't, but dude, he did a brilliant job on both books. So shout out to Damien. But one of the things that we looked at was they asked us what books would we want to do as follow-ups. We actually, can you imagine the publisher and the estate saying, okay, what do you want to do next? And we're like, you're asking us. But after the entity in the White House won the presidency, we knew that we had to do Parable of the Sower because of the prescient nature of this of it. Because of course when Octavia wrote those books, she was referring to Reagan. She was actually talking about, she was taking neoliberalism and late capitalism and all these different imperialist notions that were being espoused during that particular period, and then taking it to its logical conclusion. And so in some ways, she was creating it was almost like building a prophecy, you know what I'm saying? That kind of thing was really interesting. Something that me and my friend Ronaldo actually used to talk about quite a bit as far as aesthetics around Afrofuturism, but there always seemed to be, and not to conflate spirituality and religion, but there always seems to be a spiritual conduit or spiritual aspect to a lot of these Black speculative works that work differently, particularly if you think about religion or spirituality as a type of technology to understand our place in the world, right? Because this is what I call a pan-technological notion, where everything can be used as a technology or a freedom or liberation technology. So Lauren Olamina in the story she's a daughter of a Baptist minister, and she lives. It starts out in 2023, as I recall, and was it 2024? Very close to where we are now, and she's living in Southern California. The infrastructure of the country is falling apart. There are forest fires because we've devastated the ecology of the planet, the health of the planet. We have a an uprising of like this kind of really, really serious class differential where you have like the haves and the have-nots, you know, are even more apparent, you know. So basically a lot of the things that could happen now. So Octavia Butler was writing an alternative future to what could happen, you know, if we make the wrong decisions, which it seems like already we checked out. Even in like Parable of the Talents, there's actually a character who's president named President Jarrett, who actually says, "Make America Great Again," you know. And so you have like this populist president who's actually kind of like a fusion between Trump and Pence, actually, from ideas. You have the populist, like, you know, charisma of like Trump with like the really, really hard-edged, like, you know, essentialist Christian values of a Pence, right? In one body, you know. And so that actually happens in the second part. So it's just like some really, really like dark, you know, post-apocalyptic things that are happening. So Lauren, you know, has been looking at what's jumping around. She's actually like 15 years old, and she decides, you know, as a Black woman, you know, I need to create something better. I actually have to figure out a way. Something's going to happen where like we can't hold on to these old notions of what's going to save us, you know. So she actually creates a religion called Earthseed that actually empowers her to actually like borrow from these different religions and spiritual practices. And her idea is that we need to leave the planet. We actually need to go and seed the universe, actually, because we've actually as a people have destroyed the infrastructure of everything, you know, and it's only going to get worse. And so she's seeing this almost, and she's borrowing from it. And so the story is actually told through these like excerpts from the religious texts that she writes, called Earthseed, the Book of the Living, right? And so you have like parts of it is from her journal, and parts of it are from a religious book that actually is based off of what these teachings that she's kind of written to herself. So she's actually mobilizing an Afrocentric, I feel like it's more Afrocentric religion to actually not just save Black folk, but to save the planet. Like she becomes like almost like the mother of the planet and the shaper of the planet. And so one of the things that's really, really brilliant about like how religion is deployed in the story is that Butler utilizes the notion of like mutability and shifting and change as part of how to survive. You know what I'm saying? So God is change. It's like a mantra of, you know, of Earthseed. And then what happens is the religious leaders are called shapers. You know, so basically God is change, but you can actually like you can kind of shape things to survive. You know, so that's kind of like it in a nutshell. And that's some of the kind of like plot, you know, to a certain degree. But, you know,
Kinitra, pick up on that in regards to your work and how sort of the idea of sort of the Black woman as mother or as shaper. How does that? I guess I want to say, and Sakena, I know you do work on. How does that work, so to speak? Give us an idea of what that looks like.
I think it talks about it. I think in building on it, we can talk about how the centrality of Black women to the future, but also to the past, and also this playing with time that John is speaking about, that Butler does, that Sakena spoke about earlier on. And the idea that time is conflated, that the past and the present, and the idea that they can shape, you can shape time, right? And what is that line? It just has me thinking of that line at the end of Song of Solomon, like, you know, if you let go in the wind, you could ride it, you know, when when Milkman finally jumps, right? And this idea of that we have always had these abilities as Black folks. Afrofuturism has been a way, in addition to, you know, which is why spirituality is such an important part of it, but Afrofuturism is a way for us to key and tap into these powers, these abilities, this sense of confidence, right? these systems of knowledge that have long been there. And, you know, we're always talking about, you know, ain't nothing new. This stuff isn't new. These are old ideas, but we're able to bring and braid and, as John was saying, shape, but also weave them together in new ways, right? They're parts of a tapestry, and a new tapestry that Afrofuturism is creating by, as John says, remixing and revising the past, and bringing that into the present and then the future. And I think we also, what I always like to highlight is that we have to assess the past as well. There are some things that need to be left in the past, and that's okay. Right. And so we need to decide, like, you know, we need to leave homophobia. We need to leave sexism. We need to leave transphobia. Those are past issues that we can leave behind. And in fact, though, in a lot of ways, go to ideas that are older that were accepting of those ideas and those many different spectrums of gender and sexuality and those sorts of things. And this is why the past is important, because, you know, if we get too high in Afrofuturism, we think we're doing something new, and we ain't.
That's a good point. Sakena, you were talking before we came on. I think I caught a lot of it, so that's going to be really nice. But Sakena, you talked about a phenomenological aspect, about ways to enter into the space that is life-giving, life-affirming. Review that again, because I know some of the work that you've been dealing with really focuses on sort of the phenomenological push and pull, the warp and woof of the play that we have to.
I mean, at the core, I'm a womanist philosopher. So, and I choose that intentionally, going back to what Kinitra said, because it's a life-giving nature for me. Feminist, I'm a womanist philosopher. And as a womanist philosopher, I embrace different parts of who I am in a way that comes together. And I cited earlier, when we were talking about earlier, Mercy Odioye, one of the African parables that she lifts up. She says, we determine things, whether we keep them or leave them, going back to what Kinitra said, is whether it's life-giving or death-dealing. Whether it's life-giving or death-dealing. It comes from a Ghanaian African parable. And so when we look at Afrofuturism, it allows us to look at what's death-dealing and to evaluate it and to kind of rip it at the core. I'm using that because I'm thinking of Angela Davis when she said we get radical. We rip it up at the core. And so the life-giving aspect of Afrofuturism and African futurism is that the Africanisms allow us to look at all of who we are in our multiple ways, and be that in the different places and spaces that we are, whether it's traditional spirituality in terms of, and then many branches of Kan, Kondomble, Yoruba, Ifa, you know, we can go on, or you know, traditional African-American spirituality. So in terms of the AME Church, for example, the Black Baptist Church, one of my mentors, Shel Townsend Jokes, she's a woman, one of our womanist elders, we call her Bishop. She says that if it wasn't for the woman, that's the title of one work, she's a sociologist. So when you talk about the importance of women, you know, the women in the community, the life givers, right? That's the phenomena. How do we birth? How do we incubate? And again, using that creation, that's what we do. We create. We give birth to what the sinews, and put blood and sweat on the bones. Right? Even if they have been dead bones, we revive them.
Right.
That's an African practice, right? Examining the bones, you know? You know, that's what we do as Afrofuturists. We kind of imagine a world that may have been and bring that back, but also where are we now that we can use that to give us life for the future. Right. And of course, when we think of the Senko Faubourg, which is again an Akan part of the Akan cosmology, the Senko Faubourg stands with his feet facing forward in the present, but it's always looking back. The Senko Fa is the going back and fetching something, going back and remembering and bringing back, and so its head is always craning and awkward. And if you got your feet facing forward and your head craning back so that you can go back and fetch and retrieve and examine and leave some stuff behind, you got to be careful in the present.
Right.
And so that's the Sankofa of Afrofuturism. Jennings coined the term Sankofa narration. I've used that several times. That's the notion that we have to bring it forward. We have to, right?
May I ask a little question? It might be a little messy though.
Okay.
So in terms of the life-giving versus the death-dealing, how would we bring in Afro-pessimism into this conversation?
Now,
I said it was messy. I said it was messy.
That's the Paget Henry Lewis Gordon kind of moment. And Paget Henry and Lewis Gordon, they want to go ahead and take it into Africana existentialism. They, we need to look at those pessimistic, that negative. But if we truly are doing Sankofa, we got to look at it. We got to be awkward in the present, and we have to, like you said, leave that egg behind because that egg's rotten. Right? Look at it. We got.
Oh man, I like that.
That's not a golden egg. That's not a golden egg.
But right? that determination question, that determination needs to be made in the present about what we do with it as we move into the future.
We already made that determination. Didn't we already make that? Hasn't that decision been made?
Well, some does. Some things, have been brought forward that we need to still leave behind. Black trans lives are catching hell every day. They're still catching hell. Lives. Let's go back. We're not talking about the complementary around gender. For example, in Mali, when the Europeans came and they met the griots, right, the storytellers, the men came off the ship, the Europeans. So the griots, the male griots, came to the white male griot. Had they understood African culture, and if there were women griots would have met them. Right? And so they misunderstood the notion of complementary gender. Women have a place, men have a place and a purpose. So women griots have been around all along. But we think griot, and again, that's a colonized term, that's from the French, right? Storytellers, jele is the West African term, or again, we use griot today. But the jeles, the storytellers, the keepers of history, the keepers of knowledge, right? Those are both male and female.
Right.
Gender complementary. So that's one of those things we're returning to. But we have to, again, look at it. And why was it shifted? Why did all of a sudden that became masculinized? That became masculinized because of colonization. That became masculinized because of oppression. So we have to go back and look at the ugly eggs.
And I think we also have to consider, even in the American past, right, in the idea of why such religious practices such as conjure, which is not a religion, but a set of religious practices that a lot of Christians practice, but was also quite women-centered, as well as we're finding more and more information about queer men, right? Found that as a place of power, right? And so when we have conjure was so demonized because it was in competition for the spirits, but also economic competition with the male preachers of the Black church. And we have to consider these ideas, right? It's not just us disagreeing. It's not just us disagreeing on these spiritual aspects. It's I am in competition with you for the thoughts and minds and purses of these people. And when they go to you, they taking out the pot, right? So we have, this is a complex idea, and it was so demonized because it was so women-centered, and the Black church became so patriarchal, right? In such a way to push back against that, right? And so it's a system of recovery, right? We're recovering. We lost whole systems of knowledge. Absolutely. Do some gender, do some queer hating, right? We killed systems of knowledge. And so now we have to do the work in recovering that, because these spiritualities have been and were and still are so demonized, right? They're so scary. And I talk to my students about the fact that the only reason you're scared of this is due to anti-Blackness.
Right.
I said, you pay money to go see Thor.
Right.
You bring Buddha into your home.
Right.
So it's not about Abrahamic religions. But you're scared of Shango, right? But you cool with Zeus, who's also Superman, right?
Or Papa Midnight, you know.
Yes, right? You know? And so the thing is,
created the big boogeyman, right?
You're scared of this simply because these were gods that gave enslaved people power and knowledge. That's the only reason you're scared of them.
I mean, you can
anti-Blackness.
You can see the parallel also with, you know, midwives, certainly. That medical knowledge. Those were women who birthed babies, right?
You know,
and
absolutely.
that was shifted because they were in competition
with the gynecologists.
Therefore, we are going to professionalize the profession. Now, I'll give you an example. Was Bishop? We just had a, Reverend Dr. Fry Brown, the church historian of the AME Church. A gathering of AME scholars, the inaugural gathering of AME scholars. And several of the presentations, one particular one, spoke about what we all know, Bishop Alexander Payne. Bishop Payne was very much to respectability politics. Ring shouting, all that external, extra spiritual expression, he wanted to shrink that. Because it was demonized. It was demonized as other. It was demonized as unacceptable. It was demonized as too expressive and not respectable. It was demonized as not having the education level that it should be, should have, okay? It was also demonized in a way in which allowed for demand for education, the educated clergy. Now, that's not saying that clergy should not be educated. We're grateful for him, because now we have Payne Seminary and we have a system in place so that we do have an educated clergy. But there was a shift from natural and innate and knowledges that we did lose. That those forms of knowledge, those forms of spiritual expression was squelched. And so that's why you had a Southern and a Northern type of break, a notion of respectability that took prominence and dominance in the training of clergy.
Let me ask you all this.
Can I just?
No, go ahead. Kinitra.
We also have to account for how much Black folks Africanized Christianity.
Oh, well, yeah.
Right? And that, even though we were Christians, we weren't doing the same thing white folk. We still don't do the same thing white folks do. So we have a percussion section in our music. We shout, which is the same thing as being written by Orisha, being written by the Loa. I've done both. It's the same thing. They kill, African religions. They kill chickens, they kill goats, and then eat them and feast after, just like how we have fried chicken after Sunday service. But also I talk to my students, and I'm saying, investigating this fear of Africanized religion. And I'm like, okay, they kill chickens, might kill a goat. We killed a human being as Christians. Right? We refer to Jesus as the Lamb of God, right? And blood, do we not? That we are magically draped in his blood, and that it protects us, right? And it's invisible, but it protects us from the outside world, right? And let's talk about the interesting nature of what's considered a crazy idea. And I always ask my students, why is it okay when we as Christians do it, but it's weird when other people do it?
That's right.
That's a power game. Well, it's interesting. Go ahead, Sakena.
I want to come back to something she was saying. We could bring it full force back to just the Black imagination, right?
That's right.
For example, in the moment when people started doing Wakanda Forever and doing the crossing arms.
That's right.
That when we and Yoruba traditions, and every time you see a usher in a black church do this with their gloves on, right? Because they can't touch, and they do their walk, which is a sacred march to receive the.
Oh man, yeah.
Okay, that's very African. So I see it every Sunday in the AME church, and we see it every Sunday in the Baptist church.
We are soldiers in the army.
And we do it when you see someone Sean, as a practitioner of Look Me, when you see someone in a religion and you can see from their beating and stuff they're in a religion, you go like this. You go like this. Right. Bendizione, bless.
So this
I'm learning so much just sitting. I'm like,
yeah, John is like, mm-hmm.
It's showing up in his next comic book.
Yeah.
I was thinking I'm already working on stuff that relate, because I did talk to Sakena about this Ghanaian character, well, this Ghanaian piece I'm working on too. But no, I was thinking about this book by Eric Davis is called Technosis. It's from like the 1990s, and it talks about this fusion between like science fiction or like technology and religion and spirituality, right? And I remember when me and my friend Ronaldo came across, it was like, yo, this is actually a missing piece. And we were thinking about like Afrofuturism, but guess what? Wasn't really talking about like traditional African spirituality or traditional African belief structures. So we just call it Black Technosis. We just take it's a BLA. So it's a Black Technosis, right? This fusion of like traditionally, thought of how we think about like technology and also spirituality, which I think is actually a really big component to how we think about Black speculative culture in general, right? I mean, a classic example is Daughters of the Dust, right? Where you have the spirit of the unborn child that this man's wife is carrying, that is haunting the future. I mean, the present, right? Haunting the present, telling her father that she is his and he is her, and yeah, so it was it's just an amazing idea. It's like you said, this conflation of like time, but also like these different connections that are being made through storytelling, and of course we see this in a lot of different literature, like Stigmata, right? Kinitra?
Yeah,
I mean, not the traditional, like how they sample the Catholic idea of like Stigmata and then remix it through the markings of the body through like slavery, and also there's a time travel narrative, and it's using the stitching together of craft of the quilt. I mean, it's
being
all these things
by
like
your
technologies
ancestors.
that are being used in this way. Yeah. And what's interesting, what Kinitra was talking about is that it seems to me that that these systems that were lost were disrupted by like the religion that runs everything right now, and that's capitalism. Right now. One of the biggest, religions that everybody is like akin to is like capitalism.
Well, the whole cargo cult situation from back in the day. Right. That whole notion is clear, is sort of ripe in what's going on. I like to look at two things or make one little statement, but then ask a question that I want to see what this yields. So it's this common connectivity of the slave ship and the crossing of the Atlantic, that singular unique experience by a group of people, right? Coming to a place to where their labor and their body is used to build a new imaginative world for somebody else, right? And that we as people who had to utilize the concrete structures, the earth, the soil, our relationship with others, and what we could glean to enable us to reflect on and to connect with ourselves again, yielded all of these syncretic frameworks based upon where we were located, right? So in North America, it was the Protestant situation, right? So it was the Black churches created. In Cuba, it was, Santeria
Catholicism,
and Catholicism, and in Brazil, it was various things, Candomblé and these others, all of them as syncretic structures to stay connected and grounded in the concreteness of who we were. And you can't get away from that. And these imaginary structures that were created are just that. They were they were imaginary. You create full faith and credit in something but you don't have that thing. We had to use our hands and relationships and to build concrete sort of who we are-ness, right? So with all of that, how do we as Afrofuturists and as creators, how do we deal with the idea of outer space? And how do we use outer space in our storytelling? And how do we use it in relation to sort of, where we came? I mean, we are concrete, but you can't get more concrete than who we are, right? There's no way. So how do talk to me about the idea of outer space?
That's interesting.
Can I just this is sort of answered your question and yet not.
Yeah.
I don't think we can deal with outer space without dealing with inner space. And I think we often talk about the middle passage, but we don't always talk about the religious aspects of the middle passage. Remember, these are people who believe in trances, who believe in being written, who believe in being possessed, and that would actually be able to have outer body experiences and be outside of themselves in those holes. Right. And the psychological strength, as well as the spiritual strength that takes to be able to do that and hold that within that, from their spiritual practices is powerful and must be acknowledged. So we have to talk about the inner space that they created that was vast and knowledgeable that they brought here. Right. I think I also want to talk about this idea of syncretism and have us just complicate it a little bit more. Because syncretism often deals with two equal things that come together. And we know that they weren't exactly equal in standing. And, instead, I use this term in my book, a fluidity, right? Some things are really, really Christian and some things are really, really African. And there are parts where they're shared, but it's an oscillation. It's a movement that's there, because I've been in certain ceremonies and I'm like, ain't nothing about this Christian. Not at all. This just ain't. Whereas you also have these beautiful moments within the Catholic Church that are not fully African, right? That are not African. So we have to account for that movement and that oscillation, and to know that movement, that oscillation was a point of power. Because if something is continuously moving, you can't take a hold of it and define it. You can't take a hold of it and define it so you can change it or capitalize on it, as John was saying, or do something with it that it wasn't supposed to move, that wasn't supposed to happen. So it's a constantly moving target that is a strategy.
Yeah, no, that's a good. Sakena, what were you going?
Subjective nature is a strategy.
I want to trouble a little bit more. My name Sakena is the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. My father was Muslim, and always reminded me that there were Muslims among those slave ships.
Very much so.
So they could read. They had documents. In part, one of the tenets is you remember. You use your mind and your body. So it's embodied religion. You pray 5 times a day. And you understand the Quran, and you read the Quran, and you write in different languages. And so they brought that with them as well in the back of the slave ships. And when I, for example, when I opened up my coming back to something I was said earlier about Catholicism, when I think about, again, the Christian church and the Muslim church and their presence in Africa, well before the Europeans came. And so I opened up my semester with a Ethiopian nun, and it says Ethiopian nuns sent those Jesuits packing. And the reason because they brought Christianity to Ethiopia, during the 1st century. And when the Jesuits came to try to convert the Ethiopians in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, in this case it was the 15th century, she said, wait a minute, we got our, we're Christian, we're African Christian, right? This for millennia. We don't need the Jesuit and the Catholic Church to come tell us how to practice Christianity. We practice it in a particular way that allows for us to do it in our space, with our understanding and with our culture.
Interesting.
And so I think the same, when we think about outer space, coming back to your question, inner space, we've been doing that all along. We've been back between spaces, outer. I consider, for example, Afro-Futurist space inner space, and I consider the rest of the world outer space. Let me be clear. All right.
I'm feeling that, Sakena.
Yeah,
Right.
say that again now. Yeah, say that again.
So
now.
when I talk about Afro-Futurist space, the phenomenology of Afro-Futurist space, when I'm with Africans or African culture or African futurist thinking, being, doing, I'm in Afro-Futurist space. I'm in speculative space. I'm building, to cite another title of a book, I dream a world. I'm being given tools to dream a world. And in that, I can go outer space into the everyday life to deal with the other, right? I'm the other. I'm not the Southern.
Yeah.
Right? The other is everyone else that I have to deal with that sees me as the other. And so that inner space is Black world. What that is today, it could be in Brazil. Tomorrow, it may be for me in Ghana. It may be in Newark, Brick City, where I was born. Right? That's all inner space. But outer space is dealing with the dominant cultures that want to consider me other. Where no, that's outer space to me. And so it's about dreaming the world. And if you're not trained, and they say if you're not, Malcolm also cited this, you're not trained at home, you don't know how to act out there, right? You have to be trained at home first. So inner space, where you're trained, where you experience your African groundings, you receive knowledge and wisdom.
I love that idea.
Space is outside of that space. We talk about it in terms of Du Bois or Ansel Dua. Du Bois calls it the veil.
The veil.
Yeah.
Veil.
So the veil, we can use that metaphor as well.
Yeah. I've been researching
inside the veil. The AMEs might not like me. Go ahead and pour libations on a Sunday morning.
Well, they didn't.
I'm totally,
John?
I'm totally in tune with that, Sakena, because I was thinking about, if you think about the Great Sunrise, we talk about space as the place.
Right.
He wasn't talking about outer space. He was talking about a sacred space. He was talking about a space that is outside of time. He was talking about, these different types of Black heterotopic spaces that have different rules and regulations. I totally agree with you on that. Like the veil, to me, if you read the way that Du Bois is writing about the veil and the souls of Black folk, it's like he's writing about another dimension. It's like he's talking about an alternative. Think about it. He's really talking about a parallel universe.
Exactly.
Think about it. So for instance, I was writing this proposal the other day. And it's talking about what it means to live in two worlds, like what it means to truly live in two worlds, and to think about what that exactly means. It's like being not necessarily just split in half, but actually being able to travel between those two spaces. That's why I like the oscillation idea. That's why I love the idea of it being like another space. Yeah, the outer space is probably, I'm going to borrow from Martine Sims' The Mundane Afrofuturist, right? Because she talks about the fact that we probably won't get to outer space. We don't have the technology for a while. We don't have the funding. And if you do get the funding, it's probably going to be like some giant multinational billion-dollar company. That's why I like the idea of Alien and stuff like that. It makes more sense that companies will be able to do it, because countries probably won't be able to go way, way into deep exploration. So, she's talking about, well, how do we use Afrofuturism in the everyday? How do we use it to actually compare ourselves in the everyday? Because if you think about, if you borrow from science fiction studies, you have this idea of what they call the fictive novum, the new idea, right? So what is the new idea, And I think in the new world, quote unquote new world, the new idea was race. Race is fictional. It's a sci-fi. It's like, to me, writing about race is like writing about science fiction, or writing about robotics or something like that, or time travel, because it's not really real. It's a social construct, right? So to me, this idea of a fictive novum is something that we deal with, but through capitalism and through practices, that are about colonization. We make those new ideas mundane, right? We make those new ideas mundane by mass producing them. So if you look at science fiction and Afrofuturism, all this kind of stuff, you're looking at these new ideas that have been turned into, something that we practice every day. That's why I keep thinking about this notion of, a capitalist space being a religious space. When you're going to Comic-Con and you're getting that money out to buy that Teletubby, whatever, or that Transformer, it is a kind of worship to a certain degree. That's why it's interesting to me. I don't necessarily totally agree with the people who are outside picketing about idolatry, that notion, but there is something about the artifact these artifictions that we're like really into that that have a religious kind of connotation to them, because you know a lot of religious practices have these idols and have these altars and things that we pray to, right? I mean, how is a ATM not an altar? It looks like one to me. It really does. And actually, in the whole, me and Damien's first graphic novel, we actually have a religion called the Church of the Loving System, and we're talking about like we're using voodoo or Vodou to critique, this capitalist space, and again, that particular space, as you're saying, Aaron, was built through the decoding or the dehumanization of like Black folk into becoming things. And so that's why I like the idea of like thinking about race as a designed object or as a fictional idea that is then used to kind of like deconstitute, the African aspects of us. And we have to find that. I think Afrofuturism gives us a space to reconstitute ourselves and actually look at ourselves, And those are some of the things I wrestle with. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Aaron, can I just say?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
And I'll come back to it a little bit later if you ask. One of I opened up talking about this notion of liturgy and on space as capitalist space, and one of the parts of liturgy is the offertory.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right. And so when I talk about the material culture, the offertory in liturgy is giving of time, talent, and gifts. Well, all three of those, our time, our talent, and gifts, is what we take into that moment. Even those capitalists, even though we're using those three, but it's not just financial.
Right.
I talk about family sacrifices at Comic-Cons and in the Afrofutures community. The financial strains or the dream of a given artist, for a family to support that labor of love, and also tax systems as well.
That's right. That's right.
I talk about that magnitude of products and the cultural materials, which is overwhelming. The descriptive part of my research, I talked about having to take an extra suitcase to every Comic-Con.
That's right. Or mail stuff back.
Yeah, mail stuff back, right? See, that's next level.
Yeah, that's next level.
You're not there.
Yeah, that's next
there
level.
to window gaze. You're not there to window gaze.
No, you're there to interact.
You might be there to window gaze something, but when you go to an Afrofuturist space, and you're there to be part of the economy, because somebody's hair or somebody's nails or somebody's shoes may depend on you buying that book. So that's a different way to look at it, but you're also feeding and nurturing the Black economy.
That's true. That's totally true.
By engaging, by offering time, talent, and gifts. Right?
We are running up on the the window of time. Here's what I want to do.
So that's all we had time for. We spoke for nearly 2 hours about Afrofuturism, about Black religion, about the imagination. If you want to know more, go to NorCalMLKFoundation.org, and you'll find more information on our wonderful panelists. And we hope to see you again real soon. Peace.